Good afternoon to Eileen O'neill. Great to have you here. Eileen is a social worker and a very, very good friend. And I'd like to ask you some questions. I'm doing these Zoom interviews during COVID. And the first question is, of all the books you've read in your life, and I know you've read a lot, which book has made the greatest impact upon you?
Oh, I thought I was picking a favorite book rather than an impact book. So that might have to, well, that's thrown me because I had to think about this. The book was the thing that I found the hardest because I do feel like I've read a lot of books. I'll tell you about the book I picked. I'm just going to go off direction a little bit with your question. But the book I picked because I thought it's rare that I want to read a book twice. And there's a book called Swing, Hammer, Swing by a man called Jeff Torrington. It's from the early 90s. And it's a book that I really would like to read again. And it's because of the language in the book. I really like the way that this man writes. It's not actually a pleasant story. It's about a man who grows up in the Gorbals of Glasgow, which is the poor working class area of Glasgow. And it's a time in the 60s when housing is changing, in London as well, the same thing is happening. Lots of sort of like real derelict housing is being torn down and replaced by more suburban housing. So he's making this transition to go from the Gorbals where he's grown up and he knows it and all the rest of it, and he's making this transition to go and live in the suburbs with his wife and his in-laws, and they've got aspirations for him, but he's holding on to his life in the Gorbals. And it's just a weekend, and it's a weekend where his wife goes into hospital and he has time to just sort of run around his estate for the last time and think about where he's at in his life. So that's quite interesting. He's not a particularly pleasant man, but the language that this man writes in is just, it's Glaswegian. It's quite hard to read. I had to work really hard at it, but I loved it. And I loved the way that the poetry of his writing, even though it's often not particularly nice subject. He's not a nice man. So that's the book that I picked. It didn't have a huge impression, but it left a mark and it made me want to read it again.
That's excellent.
And I didn't know I'd kept it. I thought I'd given it away. There it is. I went and I haven't kept a lot of books, actually. I've gone through a period recently of getting rid of books and sending them off to Oxfam, and it was quite a hard thing to do, but I've kept a few, and I had kept this one. So Jeff Torrington, Swing, Hammer, Swing. That's my book.
That's a lovely answer. That's exactly what I was aiming. I think a book that you want to keep and read again, that's a book that has made an impact upon you.
Yeah.
Especially, I like the fact that you dislike the protagonist in that book. I think that's really important, not just to emotionally identify and like the person, but actually feel something essential going on.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Second question. Film. Which film have you seen in your life which you remember that has made a similar impact?
Okay, so this is the opposite of the book. The book I agonized about. The film for me is Pulp Fiction. Also early 90s, actually. It's funny, isn't it? I don't know about the time, anyway, coincidence, whatever. But also, interestingly, not particularly pleasant people in that film. But I absolutely loved it. It blew me away. I remember coming out and thinking, that this film, it goes round in circles. It's not in chronological order. You've got to follow, this plot where people are sort of both dead and alive at the end of the story because of the sort of circular nature of it and all the rest of it. But I think, again, I love the dialogue between the characters. I love the style of the film. I love the music of the film. Again, it's they're not nice people, and there's a lot of violence in it. And I don't particularly like violent films, but I think there's something comic book about, well, it is about pulp fiction, isn't it? It is about comic book stuff. So, but I just loved it. And I love the actors as well. I love Uma Thurman and Samuel Jackson, John Travolta, even what's his name? Bruce Willis, I think, has a great character in that film. Harvey Keitel. And actually, at that time, I was working in homelessness, and I had a bit of a reputation in the organisation of being a problem solver. So if people had problems they wanted to solve, they would, you know, I don't know, it's quite organised and efficient and all the rest of it. And somebody started to call me the Wolf, and it was about the same time, because this character, you know, that came and solved the problem when they'd shot the man in the head. And yeah, amazing. Love that film, absolutely love it. It's a classic.
Early 90s, I think we may have seen it together, or I certainly was in England at that time. That's one thing that came to my mind. Another thing is, yeah, we're both social workers, which might mean also that we are drawn to harsh people or harsh realities and trying to deal with them in some ways, maybe offer help or something.
Yeah.
I wonder how much that got to do with that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. It was striking that I picked two things that were not pleasant in some ways, but for me, Pulp Fiction is fun. I think it's a fun film, but also it takes a bit of thinking about and listening, and yeah, great music, obviously.
Okay, third question.
Yeah.
Which political event has made an impact upon you? And by political, I mean anything that happened in the public sphere.
This is easy as well, actually, because I grew up, I suppose, you know, I grew up in Thatcher's era. So, and I went to university in 1984. So for me, the miners' strike, 1984, 1985, the miners' strike was a huge event in my life. It was the first year that I was at university. I'd already been a bit political a bit beforehand, because there'd been cuts in education and cuts in health in the early years of the Thatcher government. But in 1984, I started at university, and it was the point at which Margaret Thatcher really had a go at the unions through the miners, and it led eventually to the destruction of all the colliery industry and all the rest of it. But it was a very it really drew me into politics in a really active way. So not just reading the paper and saying, oh, that's a terrible thing that's going on. I actually got very, very actively involved, and, you know, I was involved in sort of sit-ins and demonstrations in London, down at the docks, up in Sheffield. We were twinned with the university it was a poly then, but we were twinned with a pit village in Nottinghamshire, and so we were going backwards and forwards. We went to stay with miners came to stay with us in our student accommodation to join in the London demonstrations and things like that. So for me, it was a bit sort of, you know, put your money where your mouth is time, you know, really get actively involved in something, not just sort of sit round the sides observing what's going on. Very important time. Yeah.
Important. Yeah.
Yeah.
From England.
Yeah.
Okay, to conclude, Eileen, is there something you'd like to say, some kind of statement you'd like to end with?
Not really. Did it? No, hadn't thought I'd got to make a statement. I don't know. To everybody else that's doing this with you, you know, we're in tricky times. I hope people are finding their own ways to sort of navigate and get through it, and it's finding some joy in life. And also, you know, for us, you know, I'm just about to join a new book group. We're starting to go to the cinema again. We're going tomorrow to see a film about a man who returns to Vietnam years after leaving. And, you know, when we sit and plan going to the cinema, it makes us feel quite, oh, great, we're going out, we're getting to the cinema, and yeah, life goes on in little ways.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.